Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Imagine being born into a family where every door is locked, not to keep danger out, but to keep the truth from spilling into the light. Imagine growing up in a home where the very people meant to protect you are the same ones who corrupt you. Tonight, I will take you into the forgotten story of a son whose life was twisted long before he could even understand it. A boy who was never given the chance to choose. A son who would one day share a bed with the woman who gave him life. His own mother. This is not myth, nor whispered rumor. This is history's darkest reflection, hidden in the shadows of inbred bloodlines and unspeakable family secrets. What you're about to hear is not just disturbing, it is forbidden. The son at the center of this story was born into poverty, into isolation, into a world where family trees did not branch outward, but coiled inward like a snake devouring itself. His mother was not a stranger to inbreeding. She herself was the product of unholy unions passed down for generations. By the time he was born, the line was already fraying, unraveling into deformities, illnesses, and psychological breaks that outsiders dared not name. He entered the world with the weight of generations pressing down on him, suffocating him before he could breathe. But this is not just about biology. It is about control. It is about what happens when a child is raised in a prison disguised as a home. There were no neighbors, there were no outsiders, only family, and in that closed circle, rules bent, morality warped, and the young boy's entire reality was written by the very hands that destroyed him. His mother, lonely, broken, and born from the same poison that she passed down, saw her son not as a child, but as something else. To outsiders, this would be unthinkable. To them, it was simply the way things had always been. This boy was never taught the meaning of family. He was taught only possession. He was groomed, slowly, methodically, until the line between mother and lover no longer existed. And when he crossed it, he was no longer a victim, nor a child. He became the most inbred son in history. He was a teenager when the whispers began, though not the kind you or I would recognize, not the gossip of neighbors, not the quiet judgments of strangers. These were whispers inside the family itself, unspoken yet heavy, the kind that crawl beneath the skin. The boy had no friends, no teachers who could intervene, no church congregation to confide in. His world was a cage, and every face within it shared the same blood. His first moments of curiosity, moments that should have led him toward discovery, toward independence, were instead twisted into something unholy. His mother was there at every turn, blurring the boundaries that should have protected him. This was not sudden. It unfolded like a sickness, spreading in silence. His mother would praise him, not as a son, but as if he were a man. She told him he was special, chosen, the one who would carry their family forward, and in a world where there were no outsiders, he believed her. He had no one else to tell him that what was happening was wrong. To him, it was not abuse. It was destiny. She nurtured his dependence, fed his confusion, and when the time came, she claimed him not as her child, but as her partner. There are stories from Appalachia, from the deep rural South, from families who lived so far from the world that law and morality lost all meaning. This boy's story is not unique, though it is among the most horrifying. In those forgotten valleys, generations folded in on themselves, birthing children who carried not only physical deformities, but also the crushing weight of secrets that no one outside the mountains was ever meant to know. To speak of them was to betray the bloodline. Silence was survival. The son, still only a boy, began to see his mother's affection as both love and imprisonment. He wanted her approval, because approval was all he had ever been taught to crave. But what she demanded in return was something no child could ever give without being broken beyond repair. The line between victim and accomplice blurred, and soon there was no turning back. He slept in her bed. He shared her body, and in the cold arithmetic of family shame, he became both child and father, son and husband, victim and inheritor of a bloodline cursed long before his first breath. By the time the boy reached manhood, the damage was already carved into him, as if written in his very bones. His face bore the unmistakable signs of inbreeding, an uneven jawline, a gaze that struggled to focus, a mind that flickered between lucidity and madness. But it was not only his features that betrayed the curse, it was his silence. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who had never learned how to exist outside of his mother's shadow. She had consumed him. He was no longer her son in the ordinary sense. He was her possession, her legacy, her grotesque attempt to keep the bloodline pure. But purity is a lie. What she called destiny was in truth decay. The more they clung to each other, the more their family fell apart. Other relatives whispered, but no one intervened. In families like these, secrets were not accidents, they were foundations. Everyone knew, yet no one spoke. And so, generation after generation, the sickness passed on, each child carrying the sins of the last. The boy grew into a man with no sense of self, no identity outside of what his mother carved into him. To outsiders, he might have seemed pitiful, even monstrous. But within those walls, he was seen as the continuation of a tradition that should have never existed. And then, as inevitably as night follows day, a child was born, his child, her child, their child. The blood doubled back on itself once more, twisting tighter like a rope pulled to the breaking point. The baby's arrival was not celebrated, it was endured. Neighbors, when they caught sight of the infant, spoke of deformities they could not ignore, a head too large for its body, limbs that seemed to falter, weak and bent, a gaze that mirrored the same haunted stare as the father who was also a son. The child's very existence was a reminder of what had been done in the dark, a living monument to secrets too heavy to bury. For the man who had once been a boy, there was no escape. He was trapped in a cycle older than himself, older even than his mother. He carried not only his own shame, but the shame of a bloodline that had long since forgotten how to separate kin from lover, protector from predator. He was a victim, yes, but he was also a participant, and that duality, being both innocent and guilty, would haunt him until his final breath. The whispers eventually reached beyond the family's crumbling walls. Outsiders, curious, horrified, sometimes cruel, began to take notice. In small towns, rumors spread like wildfire, and soon his story was no longer just a private curse, but a public spectacle. They called him names. They pointed to him as proof of what happens when bloodlines are left to rot in silence. To the outside world, he was no longer a man, he was a warning. His face, his body, his very existence became a symbol of the sins no one wanted to admit could exist within their own communities. But what most failed to see was the truth buried beneath the deformities and scandal. He had never been given a choice. His first lessons in life were not about morality or faith or freedom. They were about survival in a home where silence was demanded and obedience was rewarded. His mother had carved out every path before he could walk it. By the time the world judged him, it was too late. He was already molded by something darker than any law could punish. And yet, the cycle continued. The child born from his union with his mother grew, fragile and weak, carrying the weight of secrets in every fragile breath. Doctors, when consulted, shook their heads and spoke in hushed tones about genetic collapse, about bloodlines folding in on themselves. To them, this was not a family tragedy, but a case study in degeneration. But for the man, it was his child, his blood, his shame. And still he could not break away, because breaking away would mean admitting that his entire existence had been built on horror. Isolation kept them hidden, but not forever. Families like his were uncovered time and time again by researchers, by journalists, by the rare, brave soul who wandered too far into the forgotten corners of America. Their photographs, blurred, grainy, black and white, captured faces that seemed almost unreal. And on those faces, the world saw something they feared. the reflection of what humanity becomes when it abandons morality, when it chooses secrecy over salvation. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run? Would you stay silent? Or would you dare to break the chain? Over time, the man's life became a study in decay. His body weakened early, as though years had been stolen from him before they could even be lived. His back stooped, his skin pale, his voice thin and trembling. He was not old, but he looked as though he carried centuries of suffering in his frame. The community that once mocked him slowly shifted their gaze, not out of compassion, but out of fear. He was no longer just a scandal. He was a living reminder of what happens when boundaries collapse, when family becomes both prison and coffin. And yet, even as he wasted away, his mother clung to him. She saw him not as broken, but as hers, as the one thing she had created and controlled completely. Their relationship, though monstrous, was all she had. She would sit beside him in silence, her hand on his, her eyes hollow with both pride and despair. For her, this was the only kind of love she had ever known, passed down like an heirloom of poison through the generations. For him, it was both comfort and torment, a bond that chained him until his final days. When death finally came, it was quiet. There was no headline, no obituary worth printing. His name barely appeared in records, if at all. He slipped into the earth as though he had never been, buried not only by soil, but by the silence of a family determined to erase the shame. His child, frail and marked by the same curse, followed soon after. The bloodline, once so determined to preserve itself, collapsed under the very weight of its obsession. But the story did not vanish. It lingered in whispers, in the hidden archives of researchers, in the black and white photographs locked away in dusty drawers. It became a ghost tale, passed down not to honor, but to warn. A reminder that some secrets should never be repeated, that some traditions should die with the ones who carried them. His life, twisted and tragic, is as one of history's darkest mirrors, a reflection of what happens when the sacred bond between mother and son is shattered, when innocence is stolen, when the lines of family are turned inward until nothing human remains. Even now, his story lives in the margins, where history keeps its darkest truths. Most families erase their shame, but some wounds are too deep to hide. Anthropologists and historians studying isolated bloodlines whisper about him as a case study, but what they rarely admit is that he was more than a medical anomaly. He was a tragedy born of silence. His life was not a choice. It was a verdict, written before he ever opened his eyes. He carried generations of mistakes, of sins, of secrets, until they hollowed him out completely. What makes his story so haunting is not just the horror of what he did, but the inevitability of it. He never saw a world beyond his family's walls. He never knew kindness from anyone who wasn't already tainted by the same curse. By the time outsiders judged him, they were looking at the end result, not the process that created him. To them, he was monstrous. To me, he is a warning about what happens when truth is buried, when silence becomes more dangerous than any confession. In the quiet of those Appalachian hills, where fog clings to the trees and roads vanish into wilderness, stories like his linger like ghosts. Families still whisper, still hide, still protect secrets that should never have been born. His life reminds us that horror is not always found in haunted houses or myths told around campfires. It is often written in blood, passed down behind closed doors, dressed up as love, but in truth, nothing more than control and decay. The man who slept with his mother will never be remembered by name. His photograph, if you were to see it, would feel like looking into something you weren't meant to witness. A face that is human, yet marked by something deeply unsettling. And maybe that is the point. Some stories aren't meant to comfort us. They're meant to confront us, to remind us that evil is not always a stranger. Sometimes it is born in the very arms that rock the cradle. And so we arrive at the final, unbearable truth. His story was never just his own. It belonged to the generations that came before him, each one choosing silence over salvation. It belonged to the mother who blurred the lines between nurture and violation, convincing herself that possession was love. It belonged to the community who looked away, whispering behind closed doors but never daring to intervene. He was a victim, yes, but also the evidence, the scar, the undeniable result of what happens when people turn their backs on what is right. He became a legend of horror, not because he wanted to, but because his life revealed what humanity is capable of when morality collapses. A son turned into a partner, a child turned into a father, a life turned into a warning. His face, his silence, his broken bloodline, all of it stands as testimony that there are fates worse than death. To be born into a curse is to never know freedom, to carry chains invisible to the world but crushing to the soul. And maybe that is why his story still haunts us, because deep down, we recognize that he was not a monster created overnight. He was shaped, molded, trapped by forces older than him, forces that could still exist in the dark corners of our world today. Families still hide secrets, communities still protect shame, and children are still born into prisons they cannot escape. His story forces us to ask a question that chills to the bone. How many more like him have been buried in silence, erased before the truth could be spoken? The man who slept with his mother will never have peace, not in life and not in memory, but his story remains, etched into the hidden record of America's darkest history. It reminds us that horror does not always wear the mask of a stranger. It can live within our own blood, waiting in silence, passed down like a curse. You were never supposed to hear this. You were never supposed to know. But now that you do, the question remains, will you look away like so many before you, or will you remember?